Hey everybody, it's Andy again. I'm in my backyard on this beautiful, gloomy, overcast day. Really just happy it's not actively raining right now, so I thought I'd get outside for this one. Um, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 21 today. Um, in the Gospel of Mark, Mark actually clarifies for us that what the story we're about to talk about takes place on Monday. Matthew does not. Matthew follows a bit of a different theme in terms of the progression during Holy Week that we see the stories. But the story we're about to go through in Matthew from the Gospel of Mark, we discover that this did happen on Monday, the day after Palm Sunday. And I'm talking about the temple story, the story in the temple where Jesus overturned the tables. And so if you want to read it, it's really uh, Matthew 21, 12, and 13. And then in 14 through 17, we just kind of see, we get a glimpse of a few more things that happen in while Jesus is in the temple. But this is when Jesus entered the temple. It says in verse 12, and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." So Jesus comes in, he turns the tables over, he turns their seats over, and he drives them out. And the reason that you see livestock and pigeons there is people that would come from outside of Jerusalem to Jerusalem for Passover and for the celebration when they would get to the temple. This originally actually started as a good thing. They would provide clean and unblemished animals that could be offered for sacrifice according to the criteria of the law. And if you had traveled a great way across what's known as the diaspora, or from the Jewish tribes that had been scattered throughout, if you had traveled that long way, by them offering it at the temple, you didn't have to bring that along with you. But over time, in particular, after the resettlement of Jerusalem by the Jewish people, they begin to turn a profit on this, and that's wicked in and of itself. But one of the things that I want to focus on, one of the perspectives, the dimensions that I want to look at with this today, is where this took place in the temple. This took place in what's known as the Gentile court. This is where Gentile just Bible for non-Jewish person. So if I'm not Jewish, but I worship and follow the God of Abraham, Yahweh God, this is the part of the temple that I'm allowed to be in where I can worship Him. And if you think back to basic geometry, volume is the amount of space that something has, and this has a finite amount of space. Now it's large, but it's still finite. So if we're filling this thing with tables and chairs and essentially brokers who are going to be there and charge you a high interest rate to convert your currency from another region to temple currency, which is what you had to have, which was the currency that they used there in the temple, to then go buy what you need to offer your sacrifice. Not only are we being wicked and turning a profit, but we've actually reduced the amount of people that are Gentiles that can come worship Yahweh God. And so what you see here is they're not able, there are fewer people that are able to worship so that other people can turn a profit. And what's happening is Jesus, in driving them out, in flipping the tables and flipping the chairs, he he's removing a false barrier between people and God. The false barrier was this thing that God never intended to be there. God, in placing a Gentile court, God allowed all peoples to come seek Him. But by placing these things in the court that Gentiles could be in, and a lot of the genesis for this perspective does come from our book Above All that we've been reading this year. JD does a really good job of elaborating on that more than this. But Jesus is removing this false barrier that was put there by wickedness, and that reduces who can go worship and how much time they can worship. Because it's hard to worship God if I hear livestock in the background. It's hard to worship God if I hear two guys bartering back and forth over the exchange rate between my currency from my home city state and the currency in the temple. But when we see that Jesus is removing these false barriers, I notice two applications or two categories of application for my own personal life and reflection. The first one is as it relates to me. That's a jet overhead. The first one is as it relates to me, and the second one is as it relates to others that I interact with. As it relates to me, what Satan loves to do is put false barriers between me and God by robbing my space and my time. Just like the time and the space was robbed from the Gentiles in the Gentile court, Satan likes to do the exact same thing. He's going to inject false thoughts of hoops that I have to jump through in order to access God, which flies directly in the face of what Jesus said in Matthew 11, "Come to me all who are weary and heavy laden. Come to me all. Everybody come to me." One of those false barriers Satan will put up is that I've got to be a certain type of person before I can be right with God. And if you're not a church person, if you didn't grow up in church, you would think that you're not that type of person. And that's just not the case. It doesn't matter. It's all. Jesus explicitly said all. Satan's going to try to make me busy. And in making me busy, he steals space from my calendar. He steals space from my day to encounter and meet with God. Now, sometimes that busy is a consequence of my own actions, and sometimes that busy is just the way that I'm perceiving things in that moment. So the other thing that Satan will do with me in these false barriers, these false things that aren't real, that aren't part of God's design, but get in the way of me meeting with him, is this belief that I have to be sin-free, or I have to be free of whatever my big sin is for X number of days or for X period of time, or until I no longer feel guilty about it before I can come before Jesus. And what's spoken in Scripture that directly contradicts that lie that Satan has gotten all of us to believe at one point is Romans 5:8, where it says that while we were still sinners, God showed his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christ didn't die after Andy got right so that Andy could be saved. Christ died preemptively before I was ever even born, ever even able to commit a sin, knowing full well all the sins that I would commit. And he still died and made a sacrifice for me. I don't have to get right before I come to him. And in all honesty, I can't get right before I come to him. I can become moral, but I cannot receive salvation, and I cannot have right standing with God, and I cannot be reconciled into a relationship with my Creator. There's no getting right. That's a false barrier that Satan tries to put in the way of me meeting with God. So the first category is the false barriers that get in the way of me meeting with God, and the other one is with others. I want to be mindful that I don't add to what the gospel requires, because in the gospel, Jesus paid all of the penalty for me. Jesus paid all of it. I don't want to communicate that it requires more than it does. I want to make sure that the impression that I give people about what it takes to come to Jesus is the simple acceptance of what he has done and the surrender of my life to him as Lord. Jesus showed anger when people put barriers in front of those who were trying to come to God. He did the hard work of absorbing our punishment so that we could have, after accepting this gift from him, so that we could have relationship with our Creator through him. I want to make sure that I expel any of these lies that I have believed in the past that Satan has given to put a barrier between me coming to meet with God. And I want to be mindful of what it is that I communicate to others, that Christ is seeking relationship with them because he loves them, not because they have become so good that now he can accept them into a relationship. He does that work for us. For those of you that are joining us in this fast this week of coming before God, so that we can have a more intimate knowledge and relationship and worship of who he really is. Remember, worshiping him in truth. I hope that you're beginning to see some fruit from that. If not, it's just day one. Okay? I'll hit y'all up tomorrow. Thank you.